Welcome, everyone. We're glad to have you join us tonight for our session with Lane Fischer. We're honored to have Lane as a contributor to the Hope, Recovery, and Healing team, and he comes with a wealth of experience and education. Lane is a licensed psychologist, and he has worked in many different states. He lives now in Utah. He was previously the editor of Issues in Religion and Psychotherapy. He has focused a lot of his academic work on the spiritual aspects of psychotherapy. And he has also collaborated with other colleagues on an innovative multiple family group approach to treating families who have suffered traumas. He has worked with people through many difficult things in their lives. And tonight, he's going to especially focus on helping us understand spirituality in the context of depression and how we can have hope. So with no further ado, Lane Fischer.
Thanks, Jen. It's good to be with you this evening. It's good to work with these folks at Hope, Recovery, and Healing. They're just such a great, innovative team, and I really enjoy them all. It's been really fun to work with them. So we want to talk this evening a little bit about depression, and it's going to sound in the beginning a little hopeless because we're going to talk about how much it really hurts, and then talk about how integrated all of our mind, body, spirit, and sociality really are, and how that can actually be a great advantage to us. And we'll end with a little bit of spiritual hope. So, here are the classic psychiatric symptoms of depression. You've seen those commercials talking about depression, and they'll show somebody kind of lying in bed in gray, black and white picture, and it says, depression, everything hurts. And that's true. Everything hurts, even more than the classic psychiatric symptoms acknowledge. But let's go through these classic symptoms. One is sleep disruption. That can be hypersomnia or hyposomnia, but your normal sleep pattern is disrupted. And that has its own sequelae and exacerbates other issues, because when you're not sleeping well, other things tend to be impacted. But one of the classic symptoms is all of a sudden your sleep pattern is disrupted. Another symptom is anhedonia, and I love that word because I just like saying that word, anhedonia, but it's not a very fun word. It means a loss of pleasure or interest in activities that formerly were rewarding or fun, satisfying, brought some pleasure or joy. And all of a sudden, things that previously were pleasurable aren't. Hobbies, playing with the grandkids, whatever that might be, everything becomes gray. There's a loss of pleasure, anhedonia. Another classic psychiatric symptom is negative self-referential ideation. That's when inside your head, you say really mean things about yourself, and everything is negative evaluation of self. Sometimes you can experience it as shame, which is different than guilt. Shame is just an all-encompassing sense of being bad, and it's not tied to a pathway to repairing things. It's just all encompassing. Some people think of negative self-referential ideation as anger turned inward. In fact, some people say that anger turned inward is the cause of depression. But you will get just this very negative view of self, and all the little dialogues in your head or monologues in your head about yourself are pretty negative. You also can get energy loss, where typically you've been pretty energetic or had a reasonable level of energy, and it's just gone, and you just feel no energy. And that can come as a fallout from sleep disruption. If you're not sleeping well, then your energy can be disrupted as well. You can also get a concentration disruption, which also can be attached to sleep disruption, but where you just can't seem to stick with an argument or concentrate on a task very well. Or you're reading a page and you get to the bottom and you can't remember one thing you read. And that's not just in graduate school, okay? Your concentration gets disrupted and you're just having a hard time tracking from A to B to C to D. You can also get an appetite disruption where it's a hyperphagia where you can't stop eating. You're hungry all the time. And you're just consuming and consuming and you're always hungry. Or it can go the opposite way with a hypophagia where you're never hungry and you have no appetite and nothing tastes good and you just don't want to eat anything. And either one of these can be disruptive to other processes. You can get a mood disruption. Everybody has moderate cycles in their mood. Some mornings you wake up chipper and some mornings you wake up not so chipper, or maybe you're kind of not a morning person and most mornings are hard, but by evening you're chipper again. And those of us who are morning larks start to fade away about 10 o'clock and you're just getting going. But your normal mood gets disrupted. We talk about it in terms of being a blue mood, down. And it's not always just a blue mood, it can be irritability as well, particularly when children and adolescents experience depression. They may not show blue mood, but they might show irritability, as can adults. And irritability is when you give 10 units of response for 2 units of disruption or irritation. It's like being sunburned. You have a psychic sunburn. Usually something will touch your shoulder and it's not a big deal. But if your shoulders have been deeply sunburned, somebody touches it, it hurts like crazy. And so you react to the touch on your sunburned shoulder far greater than usually you would. 10 units of response for 2 units of stimulus. But you can get a mood disruption, either blue or irritable or agitated mood. You can also have psychomotor slowing. And psychomotor slowing is where everything inside you kind of slows down. And I used to do a lot of assessments of adolescents around depression and suicide, and I would check on psychomotor slowing. And I asked this one young man 30 years ago, do you feel like you're walking through cold molasses? And he looked at me and said, I feel like I'm made out of cold molasses. And I've never heard a better description of psychomotor slowing. That just everything inside you is moving slow. Your muscles are just moving slow. And you can also get suicidal ideation, where there's really only one escape from the pain because everything hurts. And when folks get suicidal, what tends to happen is they go into a tunnel, and um, they they can only see at the end of that tunnel one solution for all this pain that's upon them all the time. And what happens is they start moving down the tunnel, and the tunnel starts to shrink. And so they they start to see only one solution to the pain, and that's suicide. This this is particularly hard for adolescents, but the thing that tends to help folks who are having suicidal ideation is to talk about it. People sometimes get skittish about asking people about whether they're suicidal, thinking, well, that will enhance the probability that they think about suicide, but it actually works the other way, because somebody who is not in the tunnel with them can see other options. When you're in the tunnel, it's like you can only see one option, but somebody not in the tunnel can ask you about what you're experiencing and can see other options. And so one of the very helpful things is to ask and to talk about it, because you can see other options that the person who's really depressed and is thinking about escape can't see. Somebody asked in a previous presentation about adolescence. Adolescent suicide is much harder because adolescents have less experience in life, and they have already fewer options in their repertoire to solve problems. And adolescents tend to especially react to interpersonal losses because of the nature of adolescent development and ego development. They define themselves in terms of their interpersonal relationships. And so an interpersonal disruption, a romantic breakup, a rejection by friends, uh, cyberbullying, where they're being put out interpersonally and scapegoated, is extremely painful for them. To be excluded from a group that they treasure is extremely painful for them. And because they don't have a lot of options already, because they don't have enough life experience, they can move down that tunnel pretty quickly. And so people have asked, well, sometimes you don't see it coming. Here's a kid who looked like they had everything going for them. And that is exactly right. They tend to hurt themselves with available means in an impulsive way in reaction to an interpersonal loss. And they might have been already feeling really bad, and then something happens and they just don't have a lot of options in their mind. And so you have to ask, and you got to stay close. You got to keep a close eye. And really danger points are when they have an interpersonal upset. One of the things that helps both adults and adolescents is writing a contract if they're feeling suicidal, that they will not hurt themselves. And then you lay out what will you do instead, and you make a copy of that contract. They keep a copy of the contract. On the contract are contact information, suicide hotline, mom, dad, uh, other ecclesiastical leaders, people who would know to get them to a hospital. And they commit that rather than hurt themselves, they will contact somebody who's outside the tunnel and go get help. Now, for me, because I tend to have a pretty high energy level in general, and typically a bright mood, when I'm depressed, people can't tell. They just can't tell all the blue mood, the negative self-referential ideation, the energy loss, because my energy level is so high. When I kind of come down, I almost look normal in terms of my energy level. But these are some of the classic symptoms. And if you have 5 or more of these and they've been hanging on for 2 to 3 weeks, there's a high likelihood that you are experiencing a major depressive episode and need to get help. Those are kind of some of the classics, but let me show you more because I'm just, full of hope right now. But wait, there's more. Because our minds and bodies and spirits and social worlds are connected. Beyond the classic psychiatric symptoms, we also see some of these kinds of things happening with depression. Social withdrawal, where you start just withdrawing from friends, family, social conflicts that could be associated with irritability. Or sometimes there's a spiritual disruption. You just can't feel peace or connection with the infinite. Now, at Hope, Recovery, and Healing, we have a functional definition of spirituality, which seems to be quite broad based, ecumenical, and seems to help us think through some of these. And that is that spirituality is the consciousness of victory over self and of communion with the infinite. And it needs all 3 of those components, that there is conscious decision and there's some sense of discipline, or for want of a better term, discipleship, and that there is some connection with something higher than self, something infinite. Those 3 components tend to define spiritual process or spirituality, regardless of the content of the religious process, per se. It's quite ecumenical and seems to work quite well. But you get a spiritual disruption where you can't feel peace or a connection with the infinite, with a higher power, if you are in recovery from any addictive process. We rely heavily on a higher power. You also can get a spiritual withdrawal where you just withdraw from your higher power. Not that it got disrupted, but you just walk away. And you can get diffuse aches and pains. It's so common for folks with fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, to also have depression. And it's sometimes hard to know what caused what, whether depression caused the diffuse aches and pains or the diffuse aches and pains caused the depression. They go together so frequently. You can get a generalized pessimism. It's not just, negative self-referential ideation, but everything is pessimistic. And you can get a loss of hope because everything is connected. When we look at a biopsychosocial and spiritual perspective, which is the perspective we take at Hope, Healing, and Recovery, Hope, Recovery, and Healing, sorry, there's a psychological dimension that's related to your cognitions, your perceptions, your attitude, personality. There's a spiritual dimension related to your faith, your spiritual experiences, higher levels of consciousness. There's a social dimension related to culture, conditions, and interactions with other people. And there's a biological dimension, biochemical, cell systems, genetic predispositions, physiological systems. None of them stand alone. What happens when we get depressed, we don't always know where it starts. It may start biologically. Some folks are genetically predisposed to experience depression. If you have a first degree relative who's had a major depressive episode, you are far more likely than the population at large to also experience a major depressive episode. And I've seen rates of 9 times higher. I think current estimates are 3 to 4 times higher than the typical normal population. And it can start biologically, but what happens is wherever it starts, biologically, psychologically, spiritually, socially, it will tend to spiral and hit every other dimension of our lives. It can start psychologically. I can start thinking really badly about myself and get a reaction, an emotional reaction to really bad cognitions, but it will tend to impact my faith experience and my social experience and my physical, biological experience. Doesn't matter where it starts, it will tend to spiral. And that all sounds so hopeless. But let me show you something more. Depression involves biological, psychological, social, and spiritual domains. And it can begin in any domain. It doesn't matter where it starts. It will tend to affect the other domains in a downward spiral because everything's connected. Well, let me talk to you about a little bit about this relatively recent term called demoralization, which I call loss of gumption. And it's really related, this term, to the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the MMPI. Let me tell you about the MMPI. The MMPI was developed in the 1930s, 40s, and used an empirical keying approach to the extant diagnostic system at that time. And what they did was at the University of Minnesota hospitals, in the psychiatric units, they had folks who were diagnosed with various conditions in the terminology and understanding of the day, things like psychasthenia, hysteria, depression, psychopathic deviant, various diagnostic categories. And what they did was they asked these people who had various diagnoses to do a card sort. And they gave them a stack of like 500 cards that had statements that could describe somebody's experience. And they asked people to put them into 3 piles: like me, not like me, cannot say. I don't know if that's like me or not. Like me, not like me, cannot say. Like me, not like me, cannot say. And then what they tried to do was look at how the various diagnostic groups tended to pile up the cards. Say, oh, these 20 cards, these 20 descriptions are often selected by folks with XYZ diagnosis. The idea was then to take that information in a paper pencil test, true false about me, and have new intakes just take true false about me, cannot say. And when their patterns match the patterns of the previously diagnosed group, then they would say, oh, well, you must have diagnosis X, Y, or Z. The diagnostic function of the MMPI never actually worked. It never worked. They couldn't actually make the diagnosis based on how people respond to true false about me across 500 and some questions. It did do something. And so interpretation of people's responses was bootstrapped to descriptive statements only rather than diagnoses. What they did was they went into the various outpatient clinics, had people take the MMPI, They'd get a scale, a 7-2 spike or a 2-3 spike or whatever. And then they would ask their therapists, can you describe this person who's got this 2-3 spike, this 2-7 spike? And then they would pull those out and say, oh, so if somebody spikes like this is how we describe them. But it never worked to give them a diagnosis. The question was, why didn't it work? Well, it didn't work because there was high overlap between the scales. People with diagnosis 7 would include cards that people with diagnosis 2 or 4 also included. And so the scales were overlapping. And so you couldn't ever really tell a nice, clean diagnosis. Now, the MMPI-2RF, which is our most current version of the MMPI, used factor analysis to create clean, independent scales. And it got rid of some of the worst scales. But now all the scales are independent. They're still not used for diagnosis. They're still used for descriptive statements only, because the diagnostic system they were based on is antiquated. We have a new nosology, and we still don't use it for diagnosis. But we can use it for descriptions. But in the process of the factor analysis, they extracted a brand new scale, which I think is brilliant. It's called RCD, or demoralization. Demoralization tends to be the common element across all scales, which says that it doesn't matter what diagnosis you have, life gets hard. Whatever diagnosis we might receive, life gets hard across many domains. Work and employment may suffer, family relationships may suffer, friendships may suffer, spiritual connections may suffer, weight and physical vitality may suffer, regardless of the diagnosis you receive. It's hard. And we get weary of the battle and we get demoralized over time. I just think this idea of demoralization is so brilliant to capture people's experience, to say, I am so weary. And it's hitting every domain of my life, spiritually, socially, psychologically, biologically. This is hard. And I want to recognize that. This is hard. Everything hurts. Now, Psalm 22, you may be familiar with Psalm 22 in the Hebrew canon. It's messianic, but it's also illustrative of demoralization. I'm going to read a lot of Psalm 22, and you can see both the messianic part, but also you should be able to hear the demoralization. I don't know when David wrote this psalm. I don't know if it was after he made his major mistake and knew that he had a hard row to hoe ahead of him. But it describes what I've experienced when I've been in a depressive state and demoralization. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why art thou so far from helping me and from the words of my roaring? Oh, my God, I cry in the daytime, but thou hearest not, and in the night season, and am not silent. But thou art holy, O thou that inhabitest the praises of Israel. Our fathers trusted in thee. They trusted, and thou didst deliver them. They cried unto thee and were delivered. They trusted in thee and were not confounded. But I am a worm and no man, a reproach of men, and despised of the people. All they that see me laugh me to scorn. They shoot out the lip, saying, they shake the head, saying, he trusted on the Lord that he would deliver him. Let him deliver him, seeing he delighted in him. But thou art he that took me out of the womb. Thou didst make me hope when I was upon my mother's breasts. I was cast upon thee from the womb. Thou art my God from my mother's belly. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, for there is none to help. Many bulls have compassed me, strong bulls of Bashan have beset me round. They gaped upon me with their mouths as a ravening and roaring lion. I am poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted in the midst of my bowels. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaveth to my jaws. And thou hast brought me into the dust of death. Dogs have compassed me. The assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I may tell all my bones. They look and stare upon me. They part my garments among them and cast lots upon my vesture. Be thou not far from me, O Lord, O my strength. Haste thee to help me. Deliver my soul from the sword, my darling from the power of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth. I've never read a better description, poetic description of depression and demoralization. My heart is like wax. It's melted in the midst of my bowels. But it is not hopeless. Depression involves biological, psychological, social, and spiritual components and tends to spiral. We may not know where the spiral started, but we don't have to know where the spiral started. Because depression spirals and affects multiple domains, we can intervene in any and all domains to create an upward spiral. We can take that liability of depression spiraling and hitting all these domains of our life and actually turn it into an asset, because improvements in one domain will tend to positively affect others. At least we can stop the downward spiral so we can catch our breath. But there is no one silver bullet. There's just lots of non-silver bullets. So whenever anybody says, looking at someone who's depressed, well, what they need to do is have better diet, or what they need to do is exercise, or what they need to do is just get out and be with people, or what they need to do is just pray, or what they need to do, just stop their stinking thinking. There's no single silver bullet, because everything hurts. There's a psychological dimension, there's a spiritual dimension, social dimension, there's a biological dimension. And if we can attack one or more or all of these dimensions in our approach to helping progress, improvements in one domain tend to spiral up and affect the others. As I think better, clearer, I'm clearer around faith issues, I tend to have a little more energy to exercise. Everything starts to spiral up. So the spiraling nature can be used as an asset. And that's what we do. We approach every one of these domains. So I like to think in terms of multiphasic interventions to create an upward spiral. I got lots of little bullets, no single silver bullet. Look, in the biological domain, medication is extremely helpful. We have really good researchers and research on the effects of medication, different approaches to medication. It's a practice and somewhat of an art, but there is science behind it trying to help with the biological dimension. And one of the things that happens if you're having this onset of depression, get to your doctor. Because if you only do medication alone, one of the things it does is it stops the spiral so you can catch your breath. But in the biological domain, exercise helps. We've seen research where exercise by itself helps with depression. Clearly, appropriate diet helps on the biological side and helps things feel better. And it all hooks together. And you may say, yeah, but when I'm in that depressed place, the idea of exercising with this psychomotor slowing is so hard. And that is true. And that's when it helps to bring in the social domain. Say, I know exercise may help me, whatever that is. I wonder if there's someone who would do it with me. Or if you are a loved one or a friend or a neighbor, somebody who's depressed, if you offer and say, hey, I need to take a daily walk. I need to exercise. Will you exercise with me? That kind of social support also hits the biological domain. There's a psychological intervention, psychotherapy, whether that's cognitive therapy or psychodynamic therapy or behavior therapy. One of the things we know in the research around psychotherapy is that there are common elements that make psychotherapy work regardless of the actual theoretical position of the therapist. There's some data that some therapies are better, but really so much depends on those common elements, the relationship between the therapist and the client. We know that medication by itself has a good impact. Psychotherapy by itself has a good impact, but you can get an interaction effect, an exacerbation, a multiplicative response when you add medication and psychotherapy together. You get a better interaction. You get better outcomes when you hit both the biological domains and the psychological domains. On the social level, engaging somewhere, anywhere with someone tends to help. And I know it's hard. I know it's hard when you're in that depressed place to reach out and engage with others because you may want to withdraw, especially if you tend to be somewhat socially introverted. You just want to go be by yourself anyway. Even when you're not depressed, you get recharged by being alone. But it does help to engage somewhere, anywhere with someone. That's why if you're a neighbor or a loved one or a friend, to find ways to engage socially helps. And there are spiritual processes in each of our faith traditions. That may be receiving blessings from priests or rabbis or friends or leaders. Fasting, occasional fasting. The research is really supporting fasting in terms of overall health. Fasting, prayer in all its forms, engaging in sacred texts, sacred music, temple service, if that's in your faith tradition. All of those, anything that you know that you have done in the past that helps connect you to the infinite, to something that's bigger than self, that brings in the beneficent, merciful power from a higher source, is a spiritual process. You put all four of those together, we don't know where it starts. It can start spiritually. It can start socially, a social trauma. It can start psychologically just with some really bad cognitions, and it can start biologically. We don't know where it starts. We don't have to know where it starts. We'll intervene in all domains. And that's what you see here in this program, actually. We have body movement, yoga, psychotherapy. We have psychiatry to help with medication. And we fully acknowledge your spiritual processes and respect and honor those. We're going to try and hit it everywhere we can. There's a couple of resources, and it's on our website, but this article in Medicines is a really fascinating article in 2017, exploring the idea of a true biopsychosocial spiritual model and what that might mean spiritually. We have a working definition. Spirituality is the consciousness of victory over self and of communion with the infinite. But this next one from Rochester, taking new, I am so sorry, taking new psychiatrists, and when you hit that link, it will take you to a training of how to do an interview that hits biological process, psychological processes, social processes, and spiritual processes. This other website, the day may have passed for that. I think it started on the 18th. But it's a free workshop around mental health. So I want to end with hope. On the heels of Psalm 22, which is the depths of demoralization, depression, the very next psalm, and I don't know if it was the next psalm as it was written, when it was written, but it certainly fits here after the pleading for help and feeling so demoralized physically, socially, spiritually. You can see it in Psalm 22. The social part, all that see me laugh me to scorn. I'm rejected. The physical part, I just feel my heart is like wax. The spiritual part, where are you? God, where are you? The psychological part, I am a worm. That's a great negative self-reference. It's just there. But on the heels of that, our sweet King David says this: the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. There is hope. There is hope on all those domains. And we acknowledge the spiritual domain. Say, our higher power can reach out, soothe, comfort, guide, help us to have hope. That's been my experience I've been through a couple depressive episodes in my life. And my experience is that everything hurts. I can attack it everywhere, but that spiritual domain is powerful. So we acknowledge that. Thanks. I guess
Thank
we'll
you.
follow this up with Q&A sometime, Hal.
Perfect. We'll open it up for live Q&A now.